All right, welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, a land of plaid and coffee. This is David, and guess what? We are going to get started here real quick with this week's Pacwest Bigfoot encounter story. So let's get started here. Real quick, however, me and the family are taking off this weekend. We'll be out in the Goose Resort area here in Southern Oregon. So if you are out there and you see that red-haired guy out there with a little beard, don't forget to walk up, let me know, and tell me your Bigfoot encounter story. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, here we go with this week's Pacwest Bigfoot encounter story. The Goose Creek Monster. Teenager watches Bigfoot from a tree. I am from Meadows, Idaho. And yes, my parents said it was okay to send you my story about me watching a Bigfoot from a tree. I was not just watching it either. I was trying to get it away from my dad. And this was not the first time I'd heard of them out this way either. Let me tell you what happened to me and my family a few years back. Of Meadows and monsters. I live in Old Meadows, not New Meadows, Idaho. My parents have a small farm and a ranch that has been in the family for a very long time now. Eventually, I will take it over, I suppose. And yes, we grow some potatoes. But for the most part, we raise animals, just so you know. However, the one animal we do not raise is the one I watched as it passed right by me out in the woods nearby. Bigfoot. It is not that I didn't believe they existed. I did before this encounter, and afterward. Of course, I'd always been a believer, and for good reason. I had learned of their existence from my parents, actually. They said it had raided the farm a few times over the years, and once it tried to break into the barn with my mom inside. They allowed me to share this with you as well, so here's what happened to them, and what I saw that day just east of me in the Pacwest National Forest. It raided our farm. It was back in the late 1980s when my mom and dad realized a Bigfoot had moved into the area, or was passing through. My dad especially knows about these things, where they come from, and when to expect them to pass through the area. He learned it over a few years and quite a few experiences, and one of them was pretty scary and dangerous. They both said it started with some animals, a couple of sheep to be exact, that had been attacked, killed, and tore apart. The story goes that my mom headed out one evening to lock things up when she'd heard some strange noises, a howling-like sound coming from pretty far away, it seemed. It was truly eerie, she said, nothing like she'd heard before, so she locked everything up and headed inside. So she told my dad about it, but he heard nothing and gave it up to coyotes. The next day, those so-called coyotes, or one of them, had torn apart a sheep. Its innards were taken, plus a hind leg. It was torn apart pretty badly, my dad had said. Usually, animals chew things up and off, and you can tell, but not this sheep. It was torn apart, literally. Then, a week later, it happened again, and in an almost exact way, except this thing took the head as well as the innards this time. The howling was heard by my dad eventually, and he knew it was exactly what Grandpa Jim had spoken about years before. That Bigfoot is real, and that a few years during a given decade, they would come wandering through the area. And so they did, because my dad saw one too. My mother was locking things down again for the evening, and my dad was inside about to get cleaned up and put me down for bed, he said. He was halfway to the shower when he heard my mom screaming. At least, he thought he had heard her screaming. He ran to the window in the upstairs bedroom he was in and saw what looked like a large person beating on the side of the barn, and heard my mother screaming from the inside. It was her. He yelled at them, but that thing started moving like the wind around to the front door, where the door was, and that set my dad off. He said he was not as afraid of this thing as he was angry that it was trying to, or seemed to, be trying to get to my mom. He ran down the stairs, grabbed the shotgun, and ran out through the kitchen and out the back door. It was massive, covered in hair, Its arms were twice the size, he said, of that Arnold guy, the actor. He also stated it was twice the size and height, it seemed, and looked like it was really angry or something. He said, and I'm positive what he said, but he said he felt like it was trying to do her harm. As for me and my encounter, well, I was scared out of my mind, and that thing was either hunting me or just curious. Either way, it knew I was around, that's for sure. He yelled again and shot into the air. That thing turned towards him, looked at him in a truly menacing way, he said, then ran off faster than anything he'd seen before. Not even Prefontaine ever moved that fast, he said. He got my mom back to the house, and they both stayed pretty vigilant after that. During the late 90s, they said they had come back through, but there were no more incidents around the property. However, around 2004 or 2007, they experienced something on the property. They even found some foot impressions, but the experience was quickly over without any dead cattle or animals. Just some sign and some sounds far off in the hills. But forward to 2013, and I found myself shadowed or hunted by one while hunting in the Pacwest National Forest. And I saw it. Pacwest and the Bigfoot. Goose Creek has some great little game trails that parallel it, so it's good for hunting. Yes, the creek could be seasonal at times, or considered that at least, but usually it was flowing. This particular year it had rained more than usual towards the end of August, and through most of September. That is when hunting season started. Mule deer is what my dad and I were looking for. Actually, the first time I had come across a monster, I was actually not hunting. I was spotting that day and locating a great place to put up a tree stand. I also came across some pretty weird things too. I guess I should have been more vocal about it to my parents, but I was pretty excited to be hunting that year. It was my first sort of on my own, I guess you'd say. My dad would be nearby, of course, but he would be on his own area where I could not see him. I would be alone. So, Thursday morning and Friday morning, I would be heading out to scope out some great spots for us. I took a four-wheeler to get out there. It was not far, but it was far enough that I was not going to walk to the foothills of the Pacwest National Forest from my house. As I said, we live outside of Meadows, not New Meadows, Old Meadows. We were still miles away from low-lying hills that led into some mountains that separated us from McCall and Pacwest Lake, a place we often went fishing growing up. But I grabbed some lunch in the four-wheeler and headed out Thursday morning, bright and early too. After a few, I made it and started settling in for a bit of a walk. I would scan the creek upstream. Not that there was much of a stream just yet, but there was a bit of running water by then. Give it a couple of weeks or so, right about the day we started hunting, and that creek would be moving pretty fast. But as I hiked up the creek, I noticed lots of deer track. A lot. I must have been about a mile past my four-wheeler when I started to notice a really bad smell, and it was a familiar one. Death. I moved closer to the creek to see if I could locate whatever it was. I did. It was really, really bad. It was a mule deer all tore up, as if it had gotten a fight with something, maybe a mountain lion, and not only lost, but it tore this deer's legs right off and ripped its stomach wide open. I'd never seen that happen, and I've seen a lot of cougar kill in the woods. But I found it, and after a few minutes of looking around for any cougar tracks, I decided to leave the area. By the way, it was sort of rocky there, and I could find no cat tracks at all. I slowly headed up a bit farther, made it about a half a mile past the four-wheeler when I found my spot. The deer sign were everywhere. It was like they had a convention there or something. I was really excited. Anyways, I found a tree I liked and marked it. It would not be hard to miss, as it was the biggest tree around and surrounded by some brush and poison oak. It looked straight out to where the deer apparently congregated, and the creek just past that. I headed back to the four-wheeler and past the carcass of that dead deer. As soon as I got to my four-wheeler, though, I noticed again a bad smell in the area. This time it was stronger and seemed like rotten meat and something else, but I could not put my finger on it exactly. It made my eyes water, to be honest. I looked around and saw nothing. No sign of struggle or a dead carcass. But nothing seemed out of place or strange other than the smell, so I left. For the next few days it rained, and the hills, the higher hills, got some early snow. Just a little dusting. Yep, up a creek and a tree. It was hunting season, not the opening day, but a few days in when my dad and I would head out for a couple of days. He was going to be on the ground, and I would be in a tree stand. The marked tree I'd chosen, my dad had put a stand up for me not a couple days after I found the spot and the carcass. My dad, however, mentioned there was no carcass around and began to remind me of handling myself around mountain lions just in case. In the back of his mind, he mentioned later, he was not worried about Bigfoot. It had been a while since anything had happened. But there we were, waking up at 4 a.m. and heading out on a crisp mid-fall morning. It would be cloudy all weekend, the forecast stated, but no rain or snow was called for, except at night, I remember. We reached the area I had chosen, and my dad moved on ahead about 100 or so yards north of my position. It was still dark, mostly, and for some reason I felt a bit, off and weirded out shortly after he'd headed off. I sat, I listened, then I smelled. Not 15 to 20 minutes after my dad vanished out of sight, I smelled something terrible. It was that other smell that day, the rotten meat and something else. Something not that good, but gross. I sat still and listened closely. The rush of the water seemed to drown out a lot of sounds, but after a few moments I could hear something moving through the brush on the opposite side of the creek. Still, it being a bit dark out, I could not tell what it was, so I did not raise my rifle. I just sat there listening, staring into the dark. After a few more minutes, I heard what sounded like a really loud and sharp whistle. Weird, I know. I mean, seriously, what out in the woods besides me and my dad whistle like that? At first, I thought it was him, my dad. But then, I saw what it was, and it was definitely not my dad. I thought my goose was cooked. It looked like a person, the shadow of it, that was. But as it started to get a little bit lighter outside and this thing moved out into the edge of the creek and into the open, I could make out a large shadow. And it was not a shadow, however. It just seemed like a shadow because it was covered in dark, jet black hair. It was long, wavy hair, and it moved a bit in the wind as it started to pick up. And so did the awful, awful smell. Apparently, that day and that morning, I was, I believe, being followed or shadowed by a Bigfoot, because that was what I realized I was staring at. A real Bigfoot. The monster from the stories I was told by my mom and my dad. This one, at least, was real. And it was looking up and down the creek, as if it was looking for me. It was tall, too. If I had to guess, I would say about 8 feet tall for sure. I was pretty high up, but not as high as I wanted to be at that moment. Honestly, I was only about 4 feet higher up than the top of that monster's head. I wish I could tell you what the face looked like, but even though the sun was finally coming up, it was too dark to see anything other than the sheer massiveness of this thing. Its shoulders were huge, and its arms as long as me, I thought. It looked up and down the creek all of a sudden, again, and then it got down on all fours. Hands and legs were all on the ground at that point. Its head kept looking up the creek and then back down, and it kept up the whistling. To my shock, something whistled back from up the creek. At first I was relieved it was not another one of these things, but I was suddenly terrified all the same as I realized it was my dad. He was answering what he thought was me and heading straight for this Bigfoot. As he whistled, the Bigfoot stood up immediately and started looking in the direction of my dad. It whistled again, and my dad whistled back just as fast. Next, I heard my dad call out my name, and that seemed to have worried this thing enough that it started growling and moving slowly up the creek towards him. I was suddenly scared to death for my dad. He had no idea what was coming his way, or what he was heading towards. He started moving a bit faster and growling louder without further thought about it. I fired a shot off in the air. It was all I could think to do. That thing turned in my direction, screamed what sounded like bloody murder, and ran off into the woods, crashing through them like a freight train. You saved me, son. I'm not sure I believe him, but my dad still believes I saved him that day. And that thing was massive. It smelled, and I can attest to what people say about their movement. They move so fast, so fluid, that it is really eerie to watch them, let alone just see one in real life. I still hunt out there. Yeah, I do. And if you were looking for a place to do some research, try the foothills and mountains around Meadows, Idaho, and the Pacwest National Forest. I'm sure you'll be pleasantly surprised of what you might find. But be careful. Be armed, as my dad would say. And the best time is late summer through fall, if you ask us, when the best time to do some research around there is. However, you'll never find me seeking these things out. And once you see one for yourself, you'll understand the natural fear I have for them. But that is my Bigfoot encounter story, Dave. Thanks. Jarrett.